The paper shook in Grace Hadley's hands. Not from the wind that howled across the dry Texas plain outside, not from the rattling of the stagecoach that had carried her 200 miles through choking red dust and blistering August heat. It shook because she had read the number at the bottom of that yellowed page so many times that her fingers had memorized every crease, every blotted ink letter, every damning zero, and still her mind refused to fully accept what her eyes already knew. $472. She stepped off the final step of that coach and onto the hard-packed earth of Caldwell Creek, Texas, in the year of 1879, and she felt the full weight of every one of those dollars pressing down on her like a boot heel on her chest. Her brother Eli had borrowed that money from a rancher named Timothy Cooper, and Eli Hadley was dead. He had been dead for 6 weeks, buried under a wooden cross on a plot of land outside Abilene that Grace had scraped together the money to pay for, which meant she had arrived in Caldwell Creek with $23 to her name, a carpetbag containing 2 dresses, a photograph of her mother, and absolutely no plan beyond walking up to that rancher's door and begging him not to ruin what remained of her family. She had promised herself she would not beg. She had made that promise somewhere around the halfway point of the journey, when the stage had paused at a water stop and a woman with kind eyes had offered her dried biscuit, and Grace had eaten it without complaint and told herself that Hadleys did not beg. They stood straight. They looked men in the eye. They presented themselves with the dignity their mother had spent her entire life modeling for them, even when that life had been hard and sparse and full of the kind of quiet suffering that never made it into songs or stories. But now, standing in the street with the August sun hammering the back of her neck, she felt that promise wavering. Because $472 was not a sum she could ever repay, not in a year, not in 5. And the note that had arrived at her boarding house in Abilene, the note signed by a man she had never met, had stated clearly that the debt was due. It had not used threatening language. That was almost worse. It had been polite, measured, the handwriting of a careful man, and that carefulness had terrified her more than any bluster or threat ever could have. A man who wrote carefully was a man who thought carefully, and a man who thought carefully about a $400 debt did not let it simply dissolve out of the goodness of his heart. She needed him too. That was the hidden truth she had not admitted to herself until this very moment, standing in the street of Caldwell Creek with wagon wheels grinding the dust around her and strangers moving past without a glance. She had come here telling herself she would negotiate, she would make arrangements, she would establish a payment schedule. But she had $23, no income, no property, no husband, no prospects, and the only thing that stood between her and complete destitution was the hope that Timothy Cooper was the kind of man who could look at a grieving woman with empty pockets and choose mercy over money. She did not know if such men existed anymore. She was about to find out. The livery stable keeper, an older man with a sun-weathered face and kind eyes beneath the brim of a battered hat, pointed her north when she asked for directions to the Cooper ranch. He told her it was about 4 miles out, that the road was straight and the gate was marked by 2 tall cottonwood trees, and that if she was going out there, she ought to know that Mr. Cooper was a fair man. Grace thanked him and tried to hold on to that. A fair man. She turned the phrase over in her mind as she arranged for a rented horse, counting out 3 of her precious dollars with hands that she forced to remain steady. A fair man could still be a hard man. Fairness and mercy were not the same thing. She had known fair men who let women and children suffer without a flicker of guilt, because the ledger balanced, and that was all fairness required. The ride north was brutal. The Texas heat in August was not the gentle warmth of a summer afternoon back in Missouri, where she had grown up. It was aggressive, oppressive, a physical force that pressed against her face and dried the moisture from her lips before she had traveled half a mile. The land was enormous and empty in a way that made her feel small and exposed, rolling grass brown to gold by the long drought scattered mesquite trees casting shadows too thin to offer any real relief, the sky an impossible shade of blue that went on forever in every direction. She thought about Eli. She could not help it. She thought about him constantly these days, the way grief works, ambushing you at random moments with a specific memory so vivid it stole the breath right out of you. She remembered the way he used to whistle while he worked. She remembered the summer he had taught her to fish in the creek behind their mother's house. She remembered the way he had looked the last time she had seen him alive, thinner than he should have been, his eyes carrying something haunted that she had not known how to name at the time. She knew what it was now. It was the weight of the borrowed money. It was the pressure of a debt he had no way to honor. Eli had borrowed that money to buy cattle, to try to build something for himself out here in the West where everyone said opportunity lived around every bend. The cattle had died of fever before he could turn a profit, and then Eli himself had followed them into the ground, taken by the same fever that burned through the herd. He had died alone in a rented room with no wife, no children, nothing but Grace's name and address in his coat pocket. She had come to settle what he owed, even if settling it meant pleading with a stranger. The cottonwood trees appeared ahead of her exactly as the livery man had described, two tall sentinels flanking a wooden gate with the name Cooper burned into the crossbeam. Beyond the gate, a long lane of hard-packed earth ran toward a cluster of buildings that shimmered slightly in the heat. A white farmhouse, solid and well-built. A large barn painted red, its boards straight and true, corrals with horses moving in them. The whole operation spoke of a man who knew what he was doing and had been doing it long enough for the work to show. She rode through the gate and down the lane and tried to breathe. A man emerged from the barn before she had reached it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that had been recently cut and a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble. He wore a plain work shirt and suspenders, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his boots dusty from a morning's labor. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two past it, with the kind of face that took its time revealing itself, the kind of face that you had to look at twice before you understood what you were seeing. He shaded his eyes with one hand as she approached, and when she pulled the horse to a stop, he looked up at her with a steady, unhurried gaze. "Help you?" he said. His voice was low and measured, careful, just like the handwriting. "I am looking for Timothy Cooper," she said, and was surprised by how level her own voice came out. Months of holding herself together had apparently strengthened something inside her that she had not known was there. "You found him," the man said. She dismounted without waiting for help, because she did not want to seem like someone who needed help, and she turned to face him with her spine straight and her chin up and her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird throwing itself at the bars of its cage. "My name is Grace Hadley," she said. "Eli Hadley was my brother. I have come to discuss his debt to you." Something moved across Timothy Cooper's face. It was not the calculation she had braced herself for, not the hardening of a man preparing to enforce his legal rights. It was something quieter and more complicated than that, something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like grief mixed with guilt, a combination she recognized because she wore it herself every single day. "Miss Hadley," he said, and his voice had changed, gone softer at the edges, "I am very sorry for your loss." She waited, because that was the danger of sympathy she had learned. It could be a door opening or a window dressing. It could mean everything or nothing at all. Men had offered her sympathy since Eli died, and then turned right around and done the hard and merciless thing. She had learned not to trust it until she saw what came behind it. "You received my letter," he said. "I did," she said. "That is why I am here." He looked at her for a long moment, this careful, steady man, and then he said, "Come inside. It is too hot to talk in the yard." She followed him into the farmhouse, and everything she saw told her more about him than any letter ever could have. The house was clean, not just surface clean, but genuinely ordered, the kind of order that came from a person who respected their own space. There were books on a shelf beside the stone fireplace, real books, not just a Bible and an almanac, but novels and what looked like a volume of poetry. There was a photograph on the mantelpiece that she glanced at quickly. A man and a woman she did not know, older, his parents perhaps. The kitchen table was scrubbed pale, and there was a coffee pot on the stove that still held warmth. He poured her a cup without asking if she wanted one, set it in front of her with a tin of sugar, and sat down across from her with his own cup between his hands. She pulled the note from her bag and placed it on the table between them. "I understand that the debt is due," she said. "I want you to know that I intend to honor it. I cannot pay the full amount today. I cannot pay a significant portion today." She made herself keep going, made herself say the hard, honest thing, because she had decided on the road that she would not dress the situation in false hope or empty promises. "I have $20. I can offer you a payment arrangement if you will accept it, though I cannot guarantee the timeline because I do not yet have employment." She stopped. She had said what she came to say. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him steadily and waited. Timothy Cooper looked at the paper on the table between them. He did not pick it up. He had clearly already read it many times and knew every word on it. He looked at it for a long, still moment, and then he looked up at Grace, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen coming, something that knocked the breath out of her more effectively than any threat or hardness would have. He looked ashamed. "Miss Hadley," he said slowly, "I need to tell you something about how that debt came to be." She had not expected that. She had expected negotiation, terms, possibly dismissal. She had not expected confession, which is what this felt like. "Eli came to me 2 years ago," Timothy said. "He was trying to get started out here. He was a good man. He worked hard and he had decent instincts and he was trying to build something honest." He paused, turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I lent him the money for the cattle. That is true and I stand by it. But what the note does not say, what I did not put into writing because I am not sure I was thinking clearly when I wrote that letter to you, is that I had promised Eli I would forgive the balance if the venture failed through no fault of his own." Grace went very still. "The fever that took his herd," Timothy continued, "that was not his fault. It moved through 3 ranches that season, mine included. I lost a quarter of my own stock. He lost everything. We had an understanding, Eli and I, that if that happened, the debt was done. And then he died before I could put that into writing, and I sent you that letter before I had fully thought about what I was doing, and I have regretted it every day since." The silence in the kitchen was profound. Grace could hear the sound of her own breathing. She could hear the distant stamp of a horse in the corral outside. She could feel the warmth of the coffee cup she had wrapped both hands around without knowing she had reached for it. "You are telling me," she said, and her voice came out very carefully, the way you carry something fragile, "that the debt was already forgiven." "Yes," he said, "I am, and I am sorry that my letter caused you to come all this way in this heat. That was wrong of me, and I should have written again with the full truth before you ever had to pack your bag." Grace Hadley, who had promised herself she would not cry, who had made it through 6 weeks of grief and 200 miles of hard travel, and the whole of the morning's terrifying anticipation without crying, felt her eyes fill up all at once. She did not let the tears fall. She blinked them back hard and gripped the coffee cup and breath through her nose and looked at the scrubbed surface of the table and waited until she had control again. "You forgive it," she said, "without my asking." "Without your asking," he confirmed, "and without any arrangement, it is done. There is no debt." She looked up at him then, really looked the way you look at someone when the crisis has passed and there is room to see them clearly for the first time. She saw the shame in his expression and the sincerity behind it, the way he was holding his own gaze steady on hers because he was not the kind of man who looked away when he owed someone an honest accounting of himself. She saw that he had kind eyes, dark and steady and carrying their own private weight, but kind. "Thank you," she said. It was inadequate and she knew it, but it was real. He nodded. Then he said carefully, "Where are you staying in town? I want to make sure you have what you need for the return journey." And that was when Grace Hadley realized that she had not thought that far ahead. She had been so focused on the confrontation, so entirely consumed by the debt and the dread of it, that she had not made any plan beyond this kitchen table. She had a rented horse and $20 and a carpetbag and no clear idea of what came next. She told him so because the honesty that had gotten her this far seemed like the only thing worth holding on to. "I see," he said. He did not fill the silence immediately, which she was beginning to understand was simply the way of him. He thought before he spoke. He weighed things. He said, "There is a decent boarding house in Caldwell Creek run by a woman named Mrs. Aldrich. She is fair and she will not overcharge you. That would give you time to consider your options." "My options," Grace repeated. "You said you do not have employment. That means you have decisions to make about where you are going and what you are doing. You should not make those decisions in a hurry." She looked at him for a moment. This careful, steady man who had just erased $472 from her life's ledger with a few quiet words, and was now sitting there offering her practical advice with the same matter-of-fact gentleness, as if he did this sort of thing every Tuesday. "Mr. Cooper," she said, "why did you really send that letter? Not the explanation you just gave me. Why did you truly send it? Because a man who promised forgiveness does not send a collection notice on impulse." She watched him and she saw the question land, saw him feel the weight of it. "I was angry," he said at last. "When Eli died, I felt it. We were not close friends, but I liked him and I had trusted him. And when he died, I felt abandoned by it in some way that I am not proud of. The letter was anger looking for somewhere to go, and then it was gone before I could call it back." The honesty of that answer did something to Grace that she had not been prepared for. She had come here armored, ready for hardness, ready for the worst kind of transaction between a desperate woman and a powerful man. She had not been ready for this, for a man who told the truth about his own failures with the same steady voice he used for everything else. "That is a very honest answer," she said. "It is the only kind I have," he said. She stayed for dinner. She had not planned to. She had not planned any of this. But he offered, quietly, without pressure, saying only that the road back to town was long in the heat, and that he had made a pot of beans that morning that would feed twice as many people as were currently in the house. She accepted, and they sat across that same scrubbed table and ate beans and cornbread and drank coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and they talked. Not about the debt. That was finished, and he had a quality she would come to recognize and treasure in him, the quality of not returning to closed subjects. They talked about Eli instead, and that was both painful and necessary. The way setting a bone is painful and necessary. She told him things about Eli that she had been holding alone since the funeral, small memories, the whistling, the fishing, the way he had read dime novels by candlelight and was too embarrassed to admit it. Timothy listened without interruption and without the awkward sympathy that most people offered, the kind that was really just discomfort dressed up in caring words. He just listened, and then he told her things about Eli she had not known, that Eli had talked about her, that he had mentioned his sister Grace with a kind of reverent pride that Timothy said had made him curious about who she was, that Eli had described her as the strongest person he had ever known. "He said that," Grace said. "Nearly word for word," Timothy said. She looked down at her plate and pressed her lips together and thought about Eli knowing that about her, carrying that about her through all his difficult years out here in this hard country, and she was grateful that no one was watching her too closely at that particular moment. After dinner, Timothy walked her back to her horse and helped her check the saddle girth without making it seem like he thought she did not know how to check a saddle girth. He told her again about Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house, told her the name of the street, said that if she mentioned his name the rate would be fair. She mounted and looked down at him, this man who had unmade her entire reason for being here and replaced it with something she did not yet have a name for. "I am going to need work," she said, "while I decide what to do next. Do you know of anyone who might need help? In town, perhaps. I can sew, I can cook, I can keep accounts. I am educated." He considered this, and she could see him actually considering it, not dismissing it, not suggesting she go find a husband as the solution, the way so many men reflexively suggested when a woman mentioned a problem. "There is a dry goods store on Main Street," he said. "Harmon's. Old Silas Harmon is getting on in years and his eyesight is going. He mentioned last month that he needs someone to handle his books. If you can keep accounts, that might suit." "Thank you," she said for the second time, and meant it just as entirely as the first. She rode back to Caldwell Creek in the long slant of the afternoon light, and the land looked different to her somehow, less empty and threatening than it had on the way out, more open and possible, the kind of landscape that could be a beginning instead of an ending. She found Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house exactly where Timothy had said it would be, and she settled into a clean, narrow room on the second floor and lay on the narrow bed, and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man with careful handwriting and kind, dark eyes who had given away $472 without being asked. She thought about him for a long time before she slept. The next morning she walked into Harmon's Dry Goods and introduced herself to a small, squinting, flour-dusted man with a magnificent white mustache and a ledger so tangled and error-riddled that it took her 20 minutes of study to understand how his business was still solvent. She spent another 10 minutes explaining to Silas Harmon what she had found in those first 20 minutes, clearly and calmly, and by the end of the conversation he had offered her a position at $1.50 a week and she had accepted it. She had been in Caldwell Creek for less than 24 hours and she had, entirely unexpectedly, a job. She did not go back to the Cooper Ranch. There was no reason to, and she was too honest with herself to invent one. She had gotten what she came for, which was the resolution of the debt, and she had gotten considerably more than that besides. She had a place to sleep, a place to work, and the beginning of a plan for the first time since Eli had died. She saw Timothy Cooper in town 10 days later. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a list of items Silas had asked her to verify for an incoming shipment, and Timothy was tying a horse to the hitching post in front of the general store across the street. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and there was a beat, a suspended moment where both of them simply registered the fact of the other's existence in this particular place and time, and then he raised his hat and crossed the street toward her. "Miss Hadley," he said. "Mr. Cooper," she said. "I took your advice about the bookkeeping position." "I heard," he said. "Silas came into the feed store talking about how someone had finally untangled his accounts and he was afraid to look too closely at what they'd found." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her, coming out of nowhere, genuine and unguarded in a way she had not been in months. It surprised him, too. She could see that, the slight widening of those dark eyes, a fraction of softening in that controlled, careful face. "How are you settling in?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "Mrs. Aldrich keeps a good house. The town is smaller than I am used to, but the people seem decent enough." "They are mostly," he said. "Like anywhere. You have your decent people and your difficult ones, and they generally manage to coexist without too much catastrophe." She smiled at that. "That sounds like a practiced diplomatic opinion." "I have had a few years to develop it," he said, and the corners of his mouth moved, the closest she had seen him come to a smile, and she found herself wanting to see it go further, wanting to see what a full, unguarded smile looked like on that serious, careful face. They stood there in the afternoon street, the two of them, while Caldwell Creek moved around them, horses and wagons and the calls of merchants and the smell of dust and livestock and the distant iron ring of the blacksmith's hammer, and neither of them seemed in any particular hurry to end the conversation. He told her about the ranch. She had not asked, but he seemed to want her to know, and she found that she wanted to know too. He had built it up from a modest start 9 years ago, when he had been just past 20, and had arrived in Caldwell Creek with a modest inheritance from his father, a decent knowledge of cattle, and the kind of stubborn patience that the land required. He had made mistakes in those early years. He said this without drama, just as a fact, and he had learned from them and built something that he was proud of now. "Do you have family nearby?" she asked. My parents passed, he said. My father 8 years ago, my mother 4. I have a sister in San Antonio, but we don't see each other often. She has a family of her own. Do you miss it, she said, having family close? Something moved behind his eyes, quiet and deep. Every day, he said. But I have built something here that I think they would have been proud of. That counts for something. She thought it counted for a great deal, actually. They parted ways with a degree of reluctance that neither of them acknowledged directly, and Grace walked back to Mrs. Aldrich's house in the warm dust of the evening, with the awareness that something had shifted slightly in the arrangement of her days, that Caldwell Creek felt, unexpectedly, like a place she was beginning to belong to rather than just passing through. She saw him again the following week, and the week after that. It was a small town, and their paths crossed naturally, at the general store, at the church on Sunday where he sat 3 rows ahead of her, and glanced back once during the sermon with an expression that suggested he found the Reverend's theatrical style as quietly absurd as she did. They began to exchange small words that became slightly longer words that became the kind of conversations you looked forward to. She noticed things about him. The way he listened with his whole attention, not impatiently waiting for his turn to speak, but genuinely absorbing what was said. The way he was treated in town, with a respect that was clearly earned rather than performed, people asking his opinion, his help, his judgment, and him giving it without condescension. The way he was careful with his words but generous with his actions, stopping to help a stranger get a stuck wagon wheel unstuck, carrying a heavy package for old Mrs. Aldrich without being asked, taking an extra moment to speak to a Mexican ranch hand named Alejandro who worked for a neighboring spread, and who other men sometimes spoke over as if he were not there. That last thing she noticed most of all. It told her something essential about his character, the way a man treated those who could do nothing for him in return. She had been in Caldwell Creek for 6 weeks when he asked her to ride with him. It was a Sunday afternoon, the one afternoon she was not working, and he appeared at Mrs. Aldrich's door with 2 horses, and an invitation framed so carefully and politely that she almost missed the nervousness beneath it. She said yes, changed into her riding dress, and they rode north out of town toward the hills that turned purple in the afternoon light. He showed her a place he clearly loved, a bend in a creek that was still running despite the summer drought, sheltered by a stand of cottonwood trees whose leaves were beginning to show the first faint blush of autumn. The water was shallow and clear over smooth flat rocks, and there was a large flat boulder near the bank that caught the sun in a way that made it warm enough to sit on comfortably. They sat on that boulder and talked for 2 hours. She told him things she had not told anyone since Eli died. About growing up in Missouri with a mother who had worked every day of her life and died without enough saved to bury herself. About the years she had spent caring for that mother through a long illness, while Eli had come west chasing the possibility of something better. About the complicated mixture of love and resentment and guilt and love again that had marked those years. About the way she had felt when Eli's letter arrived telling her he was making something of himself out here, and the way she had felt 6 weeks later when a different kind of letter arrived. Timothy listened, and the listening was like something physical, something she could lean against. He told her his own version of those years, a different specific story but with similar textures, the loneliness of building something in a hard country, the particular grief of losing parents before you were ready to be without them, the way you learned to be self-sufficient not because you wanted to be, but because the alternative was drowning. "Do you ever feel," she said, "like you have spent so long being responsible that you have forgotten what it is like to simply want something for yourself? Without immediately calculating whether you are entitled to it or whether it makes practical sense." He was quiet for a moment. The water moved over the rocks in its easy, unhurried way. "Yes," he said at last, "I know exactly what that feels like." She looked at him and he looked at her, and in the warm afternoon light beside that quietly running creek, she felt something that she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. It was not gratitude, though she felt that too. It was not the complicated admiration she had developed watching him move through his town with quiet decency. It was the particular and unmistakable sensation of being known. She thought with a clarity that was almost frightening that she might be in trouble. She was right. The autumn came to Caldwell Creek in stages, the evenings cooling first, then the mornings, then the days themselves softening their assault, the harsh gold of late summer deepening to the warmer golds and reds of October. Grace had been in town for nearly 3 months by then, and she had settled into a life that was simpler and narrower than anything she had imagined for herself back in Missouri, but that carried, unexpectedly, a quality of contentment she had not felt in years. She had her work at Harmon's, which had expanded from pure bookkeeping to helping manage the inventory and occasionally serving customers when Silas's eyes gave him trouble. She had Mrs. Aldrich's house, where she had made her room feel like her own with a few small touches, a pressed wildflower in a glass jar on the windowsill, a piece of calico fabric over the table to give it color. She had Sunday afternoons that had become, quietly and without formal announcement, the time when Timothy Cooper appeared at the door with horses and an invitation. They rode different trails each week, and he showed her the country the way someone shows you something they love, pointing out the places where deer came to water, the hill where on clear days you could see 30 miles south to where the land turned darker and flatter, the dry arroyo that flooded in spring and ran full enough to swim in. She told him about Missouri, about the green and the soft hills and the way autumn smelled different there, damper and richer. He asked questions that showed he had actually been listening to everything she had said in every previous conversation. She was deeply in trouble, and the knowledge of it had stopped frightening her. One afternoon in early November, they were riding back from the creek when his horse pulled up lame. It was nothing serious, a stone wedged in the shoe, and he dismounted and dealt with it efficiently, but it meant leading the animal back at a walk, and Grace dismounted too without being asked, because she was not going to ride while he walked. They led both horses along the trail in the long light of the late afternoon, with the dry grass golden around them and their shadows stretching long ahead of them. He said, without preamble, without the build-up she might have expected, "I think about you most of the time." She kept walking. She could feel her pulse in her throat. "That is not something I say lightly," he added, in that careful way he had, making sure she understood the weight of every word. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean." "I know that," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "I am not entirely sure what to do with it," he said. "I have been trying to be respectful of your situation. You came here in grief, and you are still finding your footing, and the last thing I want to do is make you feel like you have to manage my feelings as well as your own." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and they stood there in the trail with the horses breathing softly beside them and the enormous Texas sky turning gold above them. "Timothy," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she watched him register it, watched the slight sharp intake of breath. "I am not fragile. I am grieving, and those are different things. I have been finding my footing since I was 16 years old. I am not in danger of being overwhelmed by someone treating me with honesty and care." He looked at her. The afternoon light did extraordinary things to those dark eyes of his. "That is good to know," he said quietly. "I think about you too," she said, "most of the time." Something in his face changed then. The careful, controlled surface of it gave way, not dramatically but genuinely, the way ice thaws, slowly and then more quickly, and what was underneath was warmer than she had even imagined. He reached out and took her hand, the one that was not holding the horse's reins, and held it in his the way you hold something you have been wanting to hold for a long time, and are not sure you believed you would actually get to. They walked the rest of the way back to town like that, in the golden November light, leading the horses and not saying much because there was nothing that needed to be said. The weeks that followed had a quality of rightness to them that Grace had not known she was missing until she had it. He came to town more often, and when he did not, She was aware of his absence the way you are aware of a familiar sound going quiet. They ate dinner together at Mrs. Aldrich's table on Tuesday evenings, a thing that became ritual without ever being officially declared. And on those evenings the conversation ranged across every subject she could think of and never ran dry. She met Alejandro properly on a day. She rode out to the ranch to return a book Timothy had lent her, and she discovered that Alejandro had been working the Cooper Ranch for 7 years and had opinions about horses that were worth listening to and a quick, dry humor that she liked immediately. She met the other two hands, brothers named Walt and Pete, who were respectful in a way that told her Timothy had set a standard on his property. She walked through the barn and the house and the operation of the place with the eyes of someone genuinely trying to understand it, and what she understood was that it was good, solid, honest work done well. She found herself imagining living there. She caught the thought quickly, the way you catch a glass that is sliding toward the table edge, and looked at it honestly. It was not an outrageous thought. She was 24 years old, she had no family left. She had built a small life here in Caldwell Creek, but it was not a large life, and she had come to feel for Timothy Cooper something that she recognized, with increasing conviction, as the real thing. Not the girlish attachment she had formed briefly to a man back in Missouri, who had turned out to be interested in her mother's house more than anything about Grace herself. Not the loneliness-driven fantasy that she had sometimes been tempted by in the months after her mother's death. This was recognition. This was the feeling of seeing someone clearly and wanting exactly what you saw. The question was what he wanted. She got her answer on a cold December evening when he appeared at Mrs. Aldrich's house, not on a Sunday but on a Thursday, which was unusual, and asked if she would walk with him. Mrs. Aldrich gave them exactly the look you would expect from a woman who had been watching this courtship develop from the front row for 3 months, and Grace put on her coat and walked with him into the cold, clear winter night. He had rehearsed something. She could see that immediately, could see the preparation behind his words, the unusual lack of the natural ease he had developed with her, and she found it endearing in a way that made her want to take his hand right then and spare him the rehearsal. But she let him find his way to it, because he had earned the right to say what he had come to say. "I am not good at this," he began. "I have been alone long enough that I have lost whatever facility I might once have had for saying these kinds of things with any grace." He glanced at her sideways. "No offense intended to your name." She pressed her lips together. "None taken. What I mean to say is that I have spent the last 3 months in a state of astonishment," he continued. "Not at any single thing you have done, but at all of it together, the way you work and the way you think, and the way you face things that would level most people, the way you laugh when something genuinely strikes you as funny, the way you treated Alejandro the first time you met him as if his opinion was worth having, which it is. The way you are reading all 4 of those books I lent you simultaneously and have opinions about all 4. He stopped, collected himself. "I am astonished by you. I want to say that clearly. And I want, if you are willing, to keep being in your company for the foreseeable future. More specifically." He reached into his coat pocket and produced something, and when she looked at it in the pale winter moonlight she saw that it was a simple silver ring, a band with a small inset stone that caught the light. "Foreseeable future," she said softly. "All of it," he said. "All the future, if you want that." She looked at him, this serious, careful, generous man who had forgiven her dead brother's debt without being asked, who had told the hard truth about his own failures when he could have kept them hidden, who had listened to her as if what she said mattered and read books and treated his workers with dignity and led his horse home when it was lame rather than making her ride alone. "Yes," she said, "I want that." The wedding was small and took place in late February of 1880, in the white church on Caldwell Creek's Main Street, on a cold, bright morning with the Texas sky impossibly blue above the bare cottonwood branches. Mrs. Aldrich sat in the front pew with a handkerchief that she used without apology. Silas Harmon attended and shook Timothy's hand for a long time without letting go. Alejandro and Walt and Pete stood in the back of the church in their clean shirts and looked simultaneously proud and awkward in the way of men who are not accustomed to formal settings, but have come anyway because it matters. Grace wore the better of her two dresses, the dark blue one, and Mrs. Aldrich had pressed it and added a bit of lace at the collar that made it look, if you did not look too hard, like it had been made for the occasion. She carried a small bunch of dried flowers from the previous summer, because nothing was fresh in February, and she held them and looked at Timothy standing at the front of the church and thought about everything that had brought her here, the letter, the long stagecoach ride, the terrifying walk up that lane, the coffee at the kitchen table, the creek, the November trail with the lame horse, all of it. And she thought that grief and debt and anger and the desperate impulse of a dying man to reclaim money he had promised to forgive had led, through the most improbable series of steps, to this cold blue February morning, and the man waiting for her at the front of the church with his careful eyes and his serious face and the absolute stillness of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. The Reverend said the words, and they said their own words, and when Timothy put that small silver ring on her finger, his hands were steady and warm, and when the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, he did so with a tenderness so complete that she heard Mrs. Aldrich's handkerchief working overtime and could not blame her. The reception was at the ranch, which Alejandro and Walt and Pete had cleaned and decorated with more enthusiasm than skill. Pine boughs on the mantelpiece and paper flowers that Grace suspected Alejandro had made himself. Someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a guitar, and the dancing lasted until well past 9 o'clock. Grace danced with Timothy in the kitchen of that house that was now her house, her hands in his careful face transformed by the evening into something open and warm that she was already thinking of as her private treasure. The life they built together had the quality of a well-made thing, something crafted from good materials with care and patience. Grace took on the management of the ranch's accounts, which had been maintained accurately but without elegance, and she brought to them the same clear organizational mind she had brought to Silas Harmon's disaster of a ledger. She kept her part-time work at the dry goods store for another year before the ranch required her full attention, and when she finally told Silas she was stepping back, he squeezed her hand with both of his floury ones and told her she had saved him from himself. The spring of 1880 brought enough rain to end the drought, and the grass came back thick and green in a way that the older ranchers said they had not seen in years. The cattle that Timothy had been building back up since the previous summer's losses moved through that green grass fat and healthy, and the season's sales were the best the ranch had seen in half a decade. That spring Grace learned to love the land in a way she had not expected, the enormous sky that changed its character every hour, the way a thunderstorm built itself on the horizon with a theatrical grandeur that had no equivalent in anything she had grown up with, the particular early morning smell of the earth when the dew was still on the grass, the sound of the creek running full again after months of near silence. She went to Eli's grave in Abilene in May of that year, a 2-day ride with Timothy beside her. She stood at the wooden cross and told him everything, the debt and the forgiveness and the coffee at the kitchen table and the November trail and the February wedding. She told him she thought he would have liked Timothy. She said she thought Timothy would have liked him too. Timothy stood beside her with his hat in his hands and said nothing, which was exactly what she needed. And when she had said everything she had come to say, he put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder and let the grief move through her the way wind moves through a tree, bending it, not breaking it. On the way home, somewhere in the long flat stretch between Abilene and Caldwell Creek, she told him she thought she might be expecting. He pulled his horse to a stop. She watched his face, and what she saw there was the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on him, every layer of careful control simply gone, replaced by something so pure and uncomplicated and enormous that she felt it in her chest like the first note of music after a long silence. "Grace," he said and stopped, because apparently that was all he had. "I know," she said, and reached across the distance between their horses and took his hand. Their son was born in December of 1880, just before Christmas, and they named him Eli. Grace had suggested the name, and Timothy had agreed without a second of hesitation, which told her something she had already known about him. The boy arrived into the world with the kind of robust insistence that suggested he intended to take up his full allotment of space and noise, which he did, immediately and enthusiastically. He had dark hair like his father, and a stubborn mouth that everyone agreed was entirely his mother's. Timothy held him for the first time with the same absolute stillness he brought to everything important, standing in the room where Grace lay exhausted and thoroughly done with the whole ordeal, looking at this small, demanding, extraordinarily perfect person in his arms with an expression that Grace knew she would remember exactly for the rest of her life. The year 1881 brought changes to Caldwell Creek and to the wider world beyond it. The railroad had been pushing through Texas for several years, and there was talk that a line would come through the county before long, which meant the cattle market would shift, and the men who adapted fastest would prosper most. Timothy had been paying attention to this, and had already begun moving toward the kind of operation that would be well positioned when the shift came, diversifying into horses alongside beef, building relationships with buyers in towns that the rail would serve. Grace understood all of this and had been part of every decision from the beginning, not as a silent bystander, but as a genuine partner, her mind working alongside his on the numbers and the strategy and the long-term picture. This was not common. She knew that. She had watched enough of the other ranching families in the area to understand that the arrangement between her and Timothy was unusual, that most wives were consulted on domestic matters and kept away from the business end of things. Timothy had never treated her that way, not once, and she had never taken it for granted. She thought often about the injustice of it, the broader injustice that was simply the texture of women's lives in this time and place, the way a woman's intelligence and capability and education were considered polite accomplishments at best and irrelevancies at worst, rather than genuine resources to be used. She saw it in the way men sometimes addressed Timothy about things they were ostensibly there to discuss with her, in the way her opinions were occasionally repeated by Timothy in subsequent conversations, and received with more weight than when she had offered them directly, in the way young women in Caldwell Creek married early and handed over their futures to whatever kind of man they happened to encounter. She could not change the world. She could build something within it that looked different from the inside. Little Eli grew into a sturdy, curious, loud-laughing 2-year-old who had strong opinions about everything, and had developed an attachment to the horses that clearly delighted his father. Grace watched Timothy with his son, and felt a love for both of them so large and unruly that it still occasionally surprised her, even after 2 years of living with it. Timothy was patient with the boy in exactly the way she would have hoped, and exactly the way she had somehow known he would be. The same listening attention he gave to everyone who deserved it, turned now on a small person who was learning the world one noisy discovery at a time. There were hard times, too, because there always were. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was brutal, one of the coldest anyone in the county could remember, and they lost 15 head of cattle to the cold and the shortage of forage. A fence dispute with a neighboring rancher named Graves put Timothy in an uncomfortable position for several months, Graves being the kind of man who liked conflict for its own sake, who tested the limits of his neighbor's patience as a form of entertainment. Grace watched Timothy navigate the situation with more restraint than she privately felt was required, and when it was finally resolved, through a surveying process that confirmed the property lines exactly as Timothy had always stated them to be, she told him she had admired his patience through the whole thing. "I nearly did not have it twice," he told her honestly. The day Graves accused me of the deliberate misrepresentation, I nearly said some things that would have made a settlement impossible. What stopped you? He looked at her with that quiet directness of his. You would have had to hear about it afterward, he said. That was a sufficient deterrent. She laughed and he smiled, the full, unguarded smile she had eventually coaxed out of him, and that remained, after 2 years of marriage, one of the things she loved most. In the spring of 1882, Alejandro came to them with a situation that required careful handling. He had been sending money home to his family in Laredo for years, and his younger sister had come north hoping to find work, and she had found herself in a difficult position in a town 30 miles east of Caldwell Creek, working for wages so low they barely covered her room. Alejandro was not asking for anything, was simply mentioning it because he did not have anyone else to tell, and the conversation happened at the dinner table where all important conversations at the Cooper Ranch seemed to happen. Grace looked at Timothy. Timothy looked at Grace. Does she have any particular skills? Grace asked Alejandro. Alejandro said that his sister Maria could cook and she could sew and she was quick and she worked hard. There is a woman in town who runs a dress shop who has been looking for help for 3 months, Grace said. I have been meaning to mention it to someone. If Maria is willing to come to Caldwell Creek, I can make an introduction. Alejandro looked at her with an expression that was carefully controlled but not controlled enough to hide what was underneath it, the particular relief of a person who has been carrying a worry alone and has just discovered they do not have to. Thank you, Mrs. Cooper, he said. Grace, she said, as she always did when he defaulted to the formal. Maria came to Caldwell Creek the following month and proved herself at the dress shop within a week. She was bright and fast and had an eye for detail that the shop owner recognized immediately, and within 6 months she was essentially running the workshop. She and Grace developed a genuine friendship, meeting on Sunday afternoons for coffee sometimes when Timothy was occupied with ranch work, talking about the world and their experiences in it, with the kind of frankness that women sometimes managed in private that they had to soften and package differently in mixed company. Maria, like Alejandro, carried the awareness of what it meant to be Mexican in Texas in this particular decade, the specific texture of a world that extended you conditional welcome at best and casual contempt at worst, depending on who you were dealing with on any given day. Grace listened to these conversations with the attention they deserved and the knowledge that her own experience, while it carried its own injustices, was different in kind and did not require equivalence to be taken seriously. In the late summer of 1882, Grace realized she was expecting again. She told Timothy on the same flat, star-filled evening walk that had become their private ritual, a circuit of the ranch yard after Eli was in bed, the time when the day released its grip, and they could simply be 2 people together without the 1,000 practical demands of the life they had built. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, simply and directly, and she watched the same expression cross his face, that unguarded, enormous thing that she would never fully get used to. He drew her close and held her there in the warm Texas night, his hands gentle and certain on her back, and she leaned against him and felt the stars above them and the dark land around them, and the life inside her, and the life she had made here in this place she had arrived at, originally, out of desperation and grief, and thought that the distance between where she had been and where she was now was one of the more astonishing journeys a person could take. Their daughter was born in March of 1883, in the same room where Eli had arrived, with the same doctor and the same practical efficiency, though she was considerably quieter about her arrival than her brother had been. They named her Clara, after Timothy's mother, and she arrived with Grace's coloring and what appeared to be her father's disposition, watchful and still and utterly focused on whatever had her attention at any given moment. Eli, who was now 2 1/2 and deeply certain of his position at the center of the universe, approached his sister with the wary curiosity of someone who has been told that a significant change is coming, but was not entirely prepared for the reality of it. He spent the first day circling the cradle at a distance, occasionally reaching in to touch Clara's fingers, and within a week, he had appointed himself her official guardian, a role he took very seriously and announced to anyone who came near. Timothy watched this development with an expression of profound satisfaction. Life on the Cooper Ranch in 1883 was a full and busy thing. The cattle operation was prospering. The horse breeding program Timothy had started 2 years prior was beginning to show real returns, and the ranch had taken on 2 additional hands to manage the expanded operation. Grace had fully taken over the financial management and had, in the process, identified 3 areas where the operation could be made significantly more efficient, all of which she had discussed with Timothy, all of which had been implemented, and the effects of which were showing clearly in the year-end numbers. She had also, quietly, begun helping other women in the area with their household accounts. Not as a formal business, but as a thing that happened when the need was there. A neighbor's wife who was trying to understand where her household money was going. A widow who was trying to figure out if she could keep her small farm. A young woman who had just married and was trying to make sense of her new household situation. Grace helped them all, sitting at kitchen tables over coffee with ledgers and patient explanations, and she charged nothing because they had nothing to spare. Timothy knew about this and said nothing except, once quietly, that he thought it was one of the most valuable things she did. She told him that was a kind thing to say. He said it was simply true. The fall of 1883 brought an unexpected visitor to the Cooper Ranch. A lawyer from Abilene arrived one afternoon with papers related to a parcel of land adjacent to the ranch that had come available, land that had belonged to an old rancher who had died without heirs. The lawyer was conducting the sale. The land was being offered to neighboring properties first as a matter of practical courtesy, and he had come to know if Timothy Cooper was interested. Timothy looked at the papers, looked at Grace, and then suggested the lawyer stay for dinner while they considered it. That evening, after the lawyer had been put up at the bunkhouse and little Eli and Clara were in bed, Timothy and Grace sat at the kitchen table with the maps and the numbers spread between them and went through it together the way they went through everything. The land was good. The price was fair. It would expand the ranch significantly and give them access to a water source that would be valuable in dry years. The question was whether the current moment was the right time to extend, whether the capital outlay fit the operation's current position. They talked it through for 2 hours, going over every aspect, and at the end of it they had reached the same conclusion by slightly different analytical paths, which was that yes, they should purchase the land, and that the financing could be structured to maintain their operational buffer if they were careful in the subsequent year. The lawyer rode back to Abilene the following morning with a signed agreement. "We are going to need more fence," Timothy said, looking out at the new boundary of their land. "And more hands," Grace said. "And more horses," he said. "And a larger kitchen garden," she said. He looked at her sideways and she looked back at him, and they both understood without saying so that what they were really talking about was more life. More of this life they had built together. More of the specific and unrepeatable thing that was theirs. The winter of 1883 was mild, and the spring of 1884 came early and green, and the new land proved its worth almost immediately as the cattle spread through it, and the new water source held even as the summer heat built. Alejandro supervised the construction of the additional fence with his usual quiet competence, and the 2 new hands, a young man from Kansas named Joe and an older Texan named Franklin, settled into the operation without friction. Maria came to Sunday dinner sometimes now, and she and Grace had developed the easy shorthand of genuine friends, and watching Timothy and Alejandro talking in the yard after one of those dinners, Grace thought about all the paths that had led to this particular Sunday evening, this particular collection of people, this particular life. She thought about the note. She thought about the stagecoach. She thought about the moment she had stood in the street of this town for the first time with $23 and a debt she could not pay. She thought about walking up that lane between the cottonwood trees. She thought about a man emerging from a barn with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his eyes careful and kind. She thought about $472, forgiven without being asked. All of it, every single piece of it, had been necessary. Every hard piece had been a turning that had brought her somewhere she could not have arrived at by any easier road. She did not romanticize the grief or the poverty or the desperation. Those things were not beautiful in themselves. But the life she stood in now, this warm Sunday evening with her children playing in the yard and her husband's voice low and easy across the distance, and the smell of Maria's cooking still warm on the air, this was beautiful in the way that only things built from real struggle manage to be. She had learned something about forgiveness in the 4 years since she had first heard that word in this context. She had learned that it was not primarily about the person forgiven. It was about the person who chose to offer it, the capacity for it, what it said about who they were and what they believed about people and value and what mattered. Timothy had forgiven Eli's debt not because it was easy or because it was without cost. It had been a real loss, a real $472 in a time when that was significant. He had forgiven it because it was right, and because the kind of man he was could not comfortably do otherwise. That quality, that specific quality of grace with a lowercase g, was the thing she had fallen in love with first. Everything else had followed from it. In the summer of 1884, something happened that brought the past back in the most direct and unexpected way. A man arrived at the ranch asking for work. He was perhaps 40, weathered in a way that suggested hard years on the road, and he introduced himself as Caleb Marsh. Timothy assessed him with the usual careful attention and offered him a trial period of 2 weeks, during which Caleb worked hard and caused no trouble and proved himself competent with both cattle and horses. On the 3rd week, Caleb told Timothy something that had been sitting on him. He had known Eli Hadley years before the cattle venture, back in Missouri. He had worked alongside him for a season on a farm outside Kansas City, and remembered him as a decent, hard-working man who talked about his sister with something close to reverence. Timothy told Grace about this that evening. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment after he said it, holding the information. "He said Eli talked about you," Timothy repeated. "About how much you had done for your mother, about how he wished he could have done more to help you, that he felt guilty for coming west and leaving you to manage everything." Grace set down the dish she was holding. She pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at them. "He was not wrong to go," she said. "He was trying to build something, I understood that." "I know you did," Timothy said, "but he did not always know you understood. That is what Caleb was saying." She was quiet for a moment. "He knew I loved him," she said finally. "I am sure of that." "Yes," Timothy said. "I think he did." She hired Caleb on permanently. Not because of the Eli connection, she was careful to examine her own reasons and confirm they were sound, but because he was good at the work and honest about who he was and the ranch needed the additional hand. He became, over the following months, a reliable part of the operation, quiet and steady in the way of men who have worked through something and come out the other side. In the late fall of 1884, Grace found herself sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with Timothy, the children in bed, the ranch quiet around them, going over the year's accounts in the lamplight. The numbers were good. Better than good, actually, the best the operation had produced, the land expansion and the horse program both contributing to a year-end position that was solid and comfortable and pointed clearly in the right direction. She looked across the table at him, her pen still in her hand, the ledger open between them. "We have done well," she said. "We have," he agreed. "The land, the horses, the accounts, the children," she said, "all of it." He put down his own pen and looked at her with those dark, careful eyes that she had come to know so completely that she could read the faintest shifts in them, could tell the difference between the quiet thoughtfulness and the quiet happiness and the quiet love that all wore similar expressions on his particular face. "Is this about something specific?" he asked. He knew her well enough to know when she was building towards something. "I have been thinking about what we want the next 10 years to look like," she said. "The operation can support a third hand on the horse breeding side without strain. The east pasture could sustain another 50 head. And I think it is time to build a proper office for the accounts. The kitchen table is a wonderful tradition, but the paperwork has outgrown it." He smiled, fully, completely that smile she had catalogued and loved. "An office," he said, "with proper shelves," she said, "and room for more than one person to sit. And the third hand for the horse breeding," he said, "and the 50 additional head," she said. "That is a substantial plan," he said. "You married a substantial woman," she said. He reached across the ledger and took her hand, holding it the way he held all important things, with complete and unhurried attention. "I did," he said. "One of the better decisions I have made." "The letter was not one of your better decisions," she observed. "No," he agreed. "That is fair." "Everything after the letter was excellent," she said generously. "Everything after the letter," he said, "was you." She looked at him in the lamplight of the kitchen of the house she had walked into as a stranger and a supplicant, the house that had become hers, the house where her children slept, the house that was the center of the life she had built from nothing but necessity and courage, and one unexpected act of forgiveness. She thought about saying something elegant about that. She thought about finding the words for what it was to arrive somewhere you did not know you were looking for and recognize it completely. She decided the words could wait. She covered his hand with her other hand, both of hers over his, and looked at him in the lamplight. And what was in her expression she did not try to contain or manage or present carefully. He looked back at her and held her hands, and she let herself be held. The office was built that following spring, added to the side of the house in a good solid addition with 2 windows that caught the morning light. It had proper shelves from floor to ceiling on one wall and a large desk with 2 chairs, and within a week it had the comfortable, inhabited quality of a room that is genuinely used and genuinely loved. Grace set her pressed wildflower on the windowsill, the same gesture she had made in her room at Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house, and it made her smile to see it there, a small thread of continuity from the beginning of this chapter of her life to its current abundance. The third hand for the horse breeding was a young man from a ranch south of town, 19 years old, named Samuel, who had an instinct with horses that was evident in everything he did, and who settled into the work with a focus and care that reminded Grace of someone, though it took her a few weeks to identify who. He had Timothy's quality of not wasting words or motion, of bringing his full attention to whatever was in front of him without drama or complaint. She mentioned this to Timothy one evening. "You think he is like me?" Timothy said. "In that particular quality, yes," she said. He considered this. "I am not sure how I feel about that." "It is a compliment," she said. "Samuel is 19, he said. "It is a compliment to Samuel as well," she said. He laughed. She had gotten very good at making him laugh over the years. It still delighted her every time. The children grew. Eli at 4 was loud and brave and already trying to participate in ranch work with more enthusiasm than physical capability, following Timothy and Alejandro around the yard like a small and very vocal shadow. Clara at 2 was quiet and focused, and had developed a particular love for the kitchen garden that Grace found charming, spending long minutes crouched beside the rows of vegetables with a concentrated expression, entirely out of proportion to the activity. Both of them were healthy and happy and completely certain of their place in the world, and Grace thought sometimes that that certainty itself was the greatest thing she and Timothy had managed to give them. On a warm evening in the late spring of 1885, Grace and Timothy sat on the porch of their house in the last light of the day, watching the land go gold around them and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening, the horses in the corral, the low voices of the hands finishing up for the day, the distant call of a bird settling into the cottonwood trees by the gate. Eli was beside her on the porch, lying on his stomach with a piece of charcoal and a flat piece of board, drawing the horses with the focused intensity of someone who had discovered they wanted to do something and was doing it without reservation. Clara was in Timothy's lap asleep, her dark head tucked under his chin, one small fist curled around the front of his shirt. Grace looked at all of this. She looked at the land and the light and her children and the man beside her, and she felt something so complete and full and quiet that it was almost unbearable in the best possible way. The way music was sometimes almost unbearable, the way it pressed against the inside of you and made you understand that you were fully, entirely alive. She thought of the stagecoach. She thought of the dust and the heat and the shaking paper with its damning number. She thought of walking up that lane with her spine straight and her heart hammering. She thought of a man saying the debt was already forgiven, without her asking. She reached over and put her hand over Timothy's where it rested on Clara's small, sleeping back. He turned his head and looked at her careful, serious, generous man, his dark eyes warm and steady and full of the kind of love that had been building for 5 years and showed no sign of reaching its limit. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly, the way he sometimes asked, not intrusively, but with the genuine curiosity of a man who found her thoughts worth knowing. "I am thinking," she said, "that I came here to pay a debt." "I remember," he said, "and instead," she said, "I got everything." He looked at her for a long moment, the light going gold and long around them, Clara sleeping between them, Eli drawing his horses on the porch floor, the ranch settling into its evening quiet, the stars beginning to appear one by one in the darkening Texas sky. "So did I," he said. He lifted her hand from where it rested on Clara's back and brought it to his lips, and held it there, and she felt the warmth of it travel all the way through her. This man who had started the whole improbable journey with a single act of grace, a single quiet generosity that he had offered without fanfare and without expectation, and that had changed everything, absolutely everything, for both of them. The sky went from gold to deep blue above the Cooper Ranch, and the stars came out bright and enormous the way they only were out here in this big country, and the land around them was quiet and good and wholly theirs. Grace Hadley Cooper sat on her porch with her family and watched the stars come out and thought that the debt had been worth every penny of what it had cost to bring her here, and that everything Timothy Cooper had given up to forgive it had come back to him 1,000 times over. That was what grace did when it was real. It did not diminish the giver. It multiplied everything it touched. She had known that in the abstract once, long ago. She knew it now in her bones, in her home, in the face of her husband, in the last light of a Texas evening. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.